Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce to you the next panel, which will be on facilitating love and forgiveness in post-conflict situation, case study Uganda. And our first presenter will be Dr. Daniel Philippot, who is a professor of political science and peace studies and director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights at the University of Notre Dame. He is author of Just and Unjust Peace, an ethic of political reconciliation, and he has pursued reconciliation as an activist in Kashmir and in the Great Lakes region of Africa. Most recently, he has conducted research on forgiveness in Uganda. So I would invite Daniel to take the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. This panel will report the findings of a study on forgiveness and peace building in Uganda, and then hear from Mrs. Angelina Atyam, one of the great inspirations behind the study. I am highly grateful to the Fetzer Institute for funding this study, and to Fetzer's Curry and Thomas, who did so much to shepherd the project from beginning to end. I also thank Andre Berkley, Charlie Gardner, and the community of San Egidio for taking the lead in organizing this conference. You want to advance one? Okay, great, thanks. The final chapter of a recent book that I wrote, Just and Unjust Peace, an Ethic of Political Reconciliation, explores forgiveness in political life. One reviewer of the book for the New Republic liked the book, but questioned forgiveness. This is for rare saints, he argued, but it is wildly unrealistic and dangerous to advocate for the ordinary person, especially in politics. I had a hunch that he was wrong. Forgiveness is much more widespread and beneficial to ordinary people, even after war and dictatorship. But how to prove it? It could only be done empirically. I would have to talk to ordinary people about their experience of violence and see whether they were willing to forgive or if they had forgiven. I was aware that Uganda was a place where forgiveness is at least talked about a lot. People like Angelina Atyam have practiced forgiveness remarkably, and Archbishop John Baptist Odama have advocated forgiveness remarkably. But do Ugandans typically forgive? And does it help them? These were my questions. The strongest criticisms of forgiveness come mostly from Westerners, members of international organizations, and scholars like Danish philosopher Thomas Brudholm, who wrote a very fine book called Resentment's Virtue. Okay, that's good. They argue that forgiveness is just too psychologically difficult, disempowers victims and re-empowers perpetrators, encourages women to yield to domination, should not be pressured upon victims, circumvents just punishment, and is religious and therefore has no place in political proceedings. But others argue that forgiveness re-empowers victims by restoring their agency, is practiced by ordinary people, need not be pressured, is compatible with just punishment, and might be religious, but does not have to be, and when it is, should be celebrated. An empirical study, while it cannot definitively answer the moral questions, can get at these questions by looking at the attitudes and practices of ordinary people. Do they favor forgiveness? Do they forgive? What effect does it have? Can forgiveness be a tool for peace building? The study involves 3 different methods. A survey of 640 people in Uganda, 10 focus groups to see what insights emerged from group conversation. I think you need it. Oh, yeah, that's good. No, go back one, yeah. And 25 interviews with individual exemplars of forgiveness who emerged from the focus groups, as well as 2 interviews with leaders in forgiveness, Mrs. Angelina Atyam, who we'll be hearing from, and Archbishop Odama. The Refugee Law Project, Uganda's largest NGO for transitional justice, was an excellent partner who did most of the organizing of the project in Uganda. And Stephen Ola, who will speak next, represents RLP. The Justice and Reconciliation Project has also done first-rate research and promotion of reconciliation in Uganda and was our partner in Gulu in the north. And this will be represented by Evelyn Akulo. The survey was conducted among 640 respondents spread out over 5 separate districts in Uganda. At first, I was interested mainly in northern Uganda, where a civil war of some 20 years was fought between the Lord's Resistance Army of Joseph Kony and the government of Uganda. However, my partners at RLP insisted that I do a nationwide survey. Uganda has experienced over 60 armed conflicts since independence in 1962, and the conflicts are all interdependent. We could gain a far more holistic understanding through 5 separate districts, all sites of armed conflict. A team of 20 surveyors, 4 from each district, carried it out using smartphones. What did they find? The survey was divided into 2 parts, attitude and practice. The practice questions were answered by those who experienced violence or severe injustice. Let's begin with attitudes. What did Ugandans think about forgiveness and related practices? Well, there was strong favor for forgiveness. In a question asking victims what should happen to members of rebel groups who committed human rights violations, forgiveness was the second most favored practice, even above imprisonment following trial, amnesty, and reintegration into the community. Similar results showed up in a question regarding members of the Ugandan military, as opposed to rebel groups, though willingness to forgive was somewhat lower. Okay, now you can advance. In both of those questions, the question we just saw, confession was ranked highest in terms of what people want. This corresponds with the results of a different question, which asked people what they would require of soldiers who were amnestied before it being accepted back into the community. Here, confession and apology top the list by far, as you can see. Okay, can you advance it, Charlie? Thanks. Another question asked when a victim ought to forgive. Very few said never. The largest group would have forgiveness be conditional upon apology. Others wanted reparations for the victim first to be healed. And actually, about 1/4 said always. You can advance. Focusing just on forgiveness again, a very strong preponderance agreed that it is good for victims to forgive, 86%. In addition to favor for forgiveness, respondents reported the wide practice of forgiveness in the second line. Almost 50% said that there is a wide practice of forgiveness in my region. Although support for forgiveness is far from unanimous, support is far stronger than suggested by the skeptic who thinks that it is rare, unrealistic, and inappropriate for political situations. There was also strong favor for religious, political, and tribal leaders to encourage forgiveness. Very overwhelming majority said that these leaders should encourage forgiveness. Worries about them pressuring forgiveness did not seem strong. Why do people forgive? Religion ranks highly. Christianity was cited by many. Fewer cited Islam, although it's also important to remember that far fewer Muslims were interviewed. About 1/5 of the pool was Muslim. Oh, sorry, go back. Yeah. Culture receives lower but significant marks. Victims also cited the value of healing from anger and healing for the surrounding community. In the second to last row, more people than I thought cited psychological relief to the perpetrator, about 47%. I think that's significantly high because it shows a kind of act of generosity from the victim to the perpetrator. Part of the reason they forgive is for the perpetrator. For that many to say that, I interpret that as a fairly high number. Majorities of Ugandans think that forgiveness is good for victims. The population did not seem to see a contradiction in supporting forgiveness and punishment. You can advance things. They favored trials quite strongly. Is it important that people be, responsible for abuses be tried? Overwhelmingly, yes. Okay, go ahead. They most wanted to see leaders of rebel groups tried. Then leaders of governments tried was the second most. And then leaders of the army, members of rebel groups, the police, and ordinary soldiers, they wanted to see tried with less intensively. Okay, go ahead. Now let's look at the practice of forgiveness. I first sought to determine whether a respondent had experienced violence or severe injustice towards his own person or towards somebody very close to him or her, like a family or friend or friend. So we actually asked everybody whether they'd experienced 22 different categories of violence. If they said no to all of them, then the survey would end. They would not be a potential practitioner of forgiveness because they hadn't experienced violence. So this is not all 22, but I list these because these were ones where you had a strikingly high percentage of Ugandans, and again, this is 640 spread over 5 districts, saying that they had experienced these things. Over 60% at the top said they were victims of violence. And then moving down, very high numbers said a family member or close friend was a victim of violence, said that they or a family member or friend was forced to flee home, had a family member killed by violence, saw their home or valuable property wrecked, or felt that their life was constantly under threat. These were the top things that people had experienced most commonly. Now, what I didn't expect was that roughly 90% of the respondents remained in the survey. I didn't think that 90% of the people would have experienced some kind of violence, but they did. And so we ended up having very high numbers of people then who we could ask then, did you actually forgive? So up to now, it's been attitudes towards forgiveness. Now it's been reports of practice, or not practice, of forgiveness. So then I asked these many victims of violence how they responded to it. Generally, go ahead. Generally, victims did not feel that appropriate measures other than forgiveness had been adequately taken, such as compensation, accountability, apology, and the like. Have they apologized? Has enough been done to find out the truth? People been punished enough? Accountability? Have you received fair compensation? Extremely low numbers. People do not feel that their suffering was adequately dealt with in those ways. Also, it's interesting, and this will become important, is that few people actually had interaction with their perpetrators after the violence. The violence happened and the perpetrators, for one or another reason, disappear. They were in an army or a rebel group and they went on, or maybe they met them in the battlefield and then, went back home or what have you. So, keeping that in mind, let's advance it. Let's look at the practice of forgiveness. Now, this is, I think, a very important question. Did you personally forgive the perpetrator for the act of violence against you? And in fact, a very high number said that they forgave the perpetrator. 68.3%. I think that's quite high. But it does get more complex. However, it was also interesting that of the forgivers, only a quarter expressed the forgiveness through words. That's on the second line. And this perhaps reflects that most of them didn't have interaction with their perpetrators. More expressed forgiveness through their actions, though it is not entirely clear what the actions are. Maybe more clarity comes from the fourth line, which is that the vast majority said that they forgave a perpetrator who was not present, forgiving them in their mind or heart. And this reflects a practice called forgiving from one's heart, where one wills forgiveness towards someone who is not around. Now, how to interpret this is not entirely clear. A skeptic might doubt that the same victims would forgive a perpetrator who is present. Still, on the other hand, you could say that the wide willingness of victims still to forgive and forgive very horrible things is significant in the face of the kind of skepticism about forgiveness that I described earlier. Why do people forgive? Religious beliefs, I need to go back. So going back to about that fifth line, did you forgive because of your religious beliefs? Religious beliefs came in tied for first, and far more people appealed to that than tribal traditions or political beliefs. Religious beliefs were cited by 82%. Psychological reasons also received very high marks, as well as what I again think is a significantly high number of those who will forgiveness towards a perpetrator. So, did you forgive because you thought it would help the perpetrator to heal? That's interesting. A pretty, 57% are kind of wanting to heal the perpetrator. And then, did you feel greater peace or less anxiety or stress after you forgave? That's significant because it shows that a very high number of people reported that they benefited from having forgiven. Okay. Very few victims received an apology before they forgave. And of those who did, now that's a small number of those who did, few said that their forgiveness was conditional upon the apology. Generally, victims were encouraged to forgive, especially by religious leaders. So if you look at fourth line, did friends or family, did religious leaders, did political leaders all encourage you to forgive? Especially friends and family, and then especially religious leaders people felt that were encouraged to forgive by those people. However, the final three lines ask whether those same groups, family, religious leaders, or political leaders, pressured them to forgive. Extremely low percentages of people report having been pressured to forgive. Now, of the 28% or so, actually, if you could advance it, Charlie. Yeah, advance it one more. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, there's no more slide. Maybe that's good. Of the 28% or so of people who did not forgive, so remember 68% forgave, 28% did not forgive. We asked them why they did not forgive, and most cited reasons of conditionality, lack of apology, lack of punishment, and the undeservingness of those who committed the crime. And so now that seems to correspond to the reasons that the skeptics of forgiveness would give. So there are a significant number of people who do kind of follow in that logic. But again, it's 28% as opposed to 68% who forgave. Now, another thing that we're doing is looking at how personal attributes affect forgiveness. So we're looking at age, sex, religion, region, time since violence, education, and economic status. And with respect to a few key questions that zero in on forgiveness. Now, we don't have those results analyzed yet, so we're just starting to get to that. One that I did take a look at is sex, because I was interested in whether being a male or a female affected things. Interestingly, I found that it makes very little difference whether one is a male or a female. It doesn't seem to affect the results very strongly. Forgiveness in this survey seems to be neither a feminine virtue nor a feminine weakness, as has been claimed by various people. Overall, forgiveness is, I think it's fair to say that it's far more widespread than the skeptics seem to have allowed, that it's not just for the rare saints. People are willing to forgive unconditionally, they don't feel pressured by it, and they do it for religious reasons as well as psychological reasons. However, there are complexifying factors. Not everybody forgives, and those who did forgive in Uganda seem to have practiced something called forgiveness from the heart, where the perpetrator was not present. And you might ask, would it have been different had the perpetrator been present? That's a fair question. 1/3 of the 28% of the respondents did not forgive, and to some extent cited reasons like those that the skeptic would forgive. In general, though, I think that the survey, I think it shows that forgiveness, I think it's a positive result for forgiveness, showing that it is a widely practiced activity, but one must also, kind of chasten that or, add in the kind of complexities that I talked about as well. So now Stephen Ola is going to come up and speak, and then Evelyn Akulo. You'll speak now, Evelyn, about the focus groups and the exemplar interviews. Thank you.
But let's first follow the framework, and I would like to invite everyone to reflect on Daniel's presentation for a minute, and then we'll reconvene. Okay, so I'm sure that this was a very interesting topic, and you all have a lot of comments and reflections, but we need to move on. So let me introduce to you Akulo Evelyn Otvili, who is a documentation team leader at the Justice and Reconciliation Project. She specializes in community-centered transitional justice and reconciliation, with a focus on research and documentation of gross human rights violations such as massacres, maims, and torture. Since 2007, Evelyn has participated and led research on major massacres in northern Uganda. She has also conducted research on other conflict experiences such as sexual violence, torture, as well as local remedies for redress in post-conflict northern Uganda. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. I honor all of you in your various capacities. In your various capacities, I convey great appreciation to the conveners of this conference. I'm highly privileged to be here today. Like it's already mentioned, my name is Akulo Evelyn Otvili. I work for the Justice and Reconciliation Project, which is a non-governmental organization operating in northern Uganda. We mainly work with conflict-affected communities to empower them to promote, to preserve memory, ask for accountability and redress for the violations that they suffered during the conflict. What I'm going to share with you today or discuss with you today stems from my over 8 years of working directly or closely with war-affected communities of northern Uganda, such as massacre survivors, victims of torture or maim, survivors of sexual violations, children born in captivity of the LRA war, family of the missing persons, as well as formerly abducted persons and orphans and widows that came as a result of the conflict that happened in northern Uganda. I also bring you my own experience as someone who was once displaced by the conflict in northern Uganda at a very tender age, a night commuter at some point, as someone who underwent systematic trauma of seeing friends or close relatives being killed or forcefully taken away by the Lord's Resistance Army rebels or the LRA into captivity, many of whom were killed or are still missing to date. I also bring my experience as someone who has interacted more closely and listened to horrifying stories of survivors of conflict in northern Uganda, both during the conflict and for over 8 years that I've been working with the different victims. The topic under discussion today is of profound importance to me and to the victims I work with in northern Uganda. Specifically talking about the research that Daniel Philpott has talked about. In March 2014, or this year, I got involved in this research on forgiveness and peace building in Uganda, which was undertaken by Dr. Daniel Philpott, the Refugee Law Project, and the Justice and Reconciliation Project, where I work. In northern Uganda specifically, which I happen to be the contact person for northern Uganda during this research period, our first focus group discussion, which were part of the methodologies that we used during this research process, was conducted between the 12th and the 13th of March. Participants to the focus group discussions were mainly sought through public calls or notice on major public notice boards, as well as radio announcements of public radios such as Radio Mega, after which the majority of the respondents voluntarily expressed their interest in participating in the focus group discussion that we were going to hold in Gulo. Being a contact person, after the notice were put out, radio announcements went out, I got overwhelming responses from different people who wanted to participate in the research process. The question then was, how do you select? You have calls coming from all over. And at the end of the day, you need only 30 participants for the focus group discussions. So I had to critically check out the categories of people that we needed for the focus group discussions. So at the end of the day, I settled for the different experiences that survivors of conflicts underwent, their age variation, the sex, whether they were women or men, level of education, as well as their economic status. At the end of the day, we were able to get 30 participants who participated in the focus group discussions in Gulo. In the focus group discussion, we were mainly trying to gauge their perspective on what peace meant to them, what justice meant to them, as well as give them opportunities or platform to share their personal experiences of the conflict in northern Uganda, and upon that basis, what forgiveness means to them, the process, and whether or not they, as victims of conflict, had forgiven the perpetrators of violations. I must confess here that it was not an easy moment. It was a tense moment with different participants occasionally breaking down as they shared their experiences. And to empower them emotionally as researchers in this process, we had to engage an in-house psychosocial expert who talked to them most of the times when they broke down. And also we put in place a referral system where those we felt needed more psychosocial support were referred after the focus group discussions. Findings from the focus group discussions were built into the research or the survey tool that were eventually administered to the 640 participants across the different districts of Uganda. In July 2014, we embarked on the survey. In northern Uganda, where I headed, we ran, with the help of about 3 other researchers, the 4th one being myself, we randomly selected 120 persons in northern Uganda, and each of the different researchers went to the different divisions of Gulo, such as Badege Division, Layibi Division, Peche, and Laro. From the division, we went further into the peri-urban settings under each division, and further into the rural settings of the sub-counties. In the end, at the sub-county level, we went to Koch Goma sub-county, Bongatira, Odek, and Lakwana. Participation to the survey was purely voluntary, and consent from participants had to be got before we proceeded with the process. Considerations were also given to the gender, different conflict experiences, socioeconomic status, age, as well as level of education. All surveys were either conducted in Luo or English for the case of northern Uganda. Findings from the surveys, as already stated by Dr. Daniel Philpott, nearly all the persons the researchers talked to had lost close relatives or friends during the conflict in northern Uganda. Nearly all the respondents we talked to had close relatives or friends abducted during the conflict. And nearly all the respondents confirmed still having loved ones or friends still missing as a result of the northern Uganda conflict. The majority of the people we talked to were either displaced or had their properties destroyed during the conflict. Majority of our female respondents had suffered sexual violations, such as rape during the 2-decade war in northern Uganda. And majority of our respondents still exhibited some level of trauma or ill feeling towards their lack of engagement in the post-conflict northern Uganda. They were more compelled to show that ill feeling towards the lack of truth-seeking mechanisms in northern Uganda after the conflict, the lack of reparation for the violations that they suffered, and also the inability to search and give closure for the people who still had their relatives missing as a result of the conflict, as well as limited scope of recoveries that people are undergoing in northern Uganda. Nonetheless, respondents express overwhelming support for forgiveness as the only remedy they have for their own personal healing and for harmonious coexistence in the communities in which they live. It was interesting seeing those who had undergone traumatic events. For example, there is a lady we interacted with who was raped at different intervals by over 16 men or armed men during the conflict. The same lady was infected with HIV/AIDS, had her child killed by a rebel during the conflict, and as a result of the sexual violation she had undergone during the conflict, when her husband's family discovered what she had undergone, they actually chased her away from her marital home. And in addition to that, as an individual, because of the many men who had sexually violated her, she had a medical condition called fistula, where constantly she was passing out urine and feces. But it was shocking to me to hear this lady say this about forgiveness. These were her own words. She said, "It is not this or that. It is my decision that I chose to forgive. It is my choice. And when I tell you to forgive, it is me telling you what I feel and experience and has worked for me. It is what has given me the hope to live and the courage to carry on a message of forgiveness." To back on what the quote I got from this woman, I also had interaction with those who lost all their parents during the conflict, were displaced or abducted. For them, they express lack of forgiveness as a situation where a person, especially a victim, is taking poisonous medication, hoping that it will kill the offender or the perpetrator. That it will kill the perpetrator. They cried out about the pain of lack of forgiveness, self-bitterness, and a state of hopelessness, and noted that their only help have come through forgiveness. In forgiveness, they felt relief and human again. Respondent noted that during the conflict, different things or persons caused them different sufferings and pain, and the weight of piling all this suffering onto them had become so heavy that it became practically impossible for them to move forward. Time and again, they would say, actually, I remember a situation during the focus group discussion where a respondent was giving his own personal experience of forgiveness, and he asked us to give him all the heavy loads that we had in the room. We gave him chairs, we gave him books, we gave him bags. We piled up things on him to the point that he actually started bending backward. Then he said, this is the status of lack of forgiveness. You have so much baggage to carry. In life, you meet so many circumstances that compel you to move beyond. So if you continue carrying on all these hats or this baggage from one violator to the other, it becomes impossible for you to move forward. So he said for him to be relieved, to get the baggage of him, he needed to throw away all the weights. And the only way he could do that was through forgiveness. This was really very powerful. I was also keen to know from them what their motivation for forgiveness were. a lot of them say they chose to forgive because of the need for personal healing. They felt that no wrong is too big to be redeemed. And because also of their strong Christian belief, as well as culture that embeds forgiveness as a core value. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Evelyn, for this very touching and inspiring story. So again, I would ask everyone to take a minute to reflect and talk about Evelyn's presentation. Okay, so let us move on slowly, and I would like to introduce to you Stephen Ula, who heads Research and Advocacy Department at the Refugee Law Project, School of Law, Makerere University in Uganda. He's also a coordinator of the DFID-funded Advisory Consortium on Conflict Sensitivity. Ula is currently leading the National Reconciliation and Transitional Justice Audit countrywide study to map out conflicts and their legacies in Uganda and its ramification to transitional justice initiatives. And he will speak a little bit about the movie called To Forgive or Not, Attitudes Towards Forgiveness in Post-War Uganda, and then we will show the movie. Okay, so Stephen, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I also want to add my voice in thanking the Fraser Institute and all the organizers for bringing us to DC. And I want to reflect on what Daniel and Evelyn just presented to you by taking you to other parts of the country, not necessarily northern Uganda. As Daniel said, Uganda has endured a legacy of violence since independence and even before. And instead of recounting exactly what Evelyn said, which came across from all the different districts where the research was conducted, I decided to put it in a short documentary as my presentation. I would have recounted the same story, but I think it's important for you to hear from the survivors, the victims that Evelyn talked about. We did this focus group discussion in 5 different districts. We met about 30 youth and 30 adults in each district. We had about 5 different key informants interview, having in-depth discussion with individuals who had shared their experience in this regard. And as Evelyn said, many of them had experienced these violations firsthand, and they had gone through very different processes on how to deal with it, how to carry the baggage. And by the time they arrived, for those who decided to forgive, by the time they arrived at the decision to let go, they had endured an enormous suffering. And we found this to resonate quite well with those who experience it more directly. In Luwero, where we met a group of young people who did not directly suffer the violence, they found it more difficult to forgive. They were more bitter than their fathers, the mothers who had been brutalized during the war. We also found that even though you can find a group of people who are forgiven, sometimes they all forgive for very different reasons, and they expect very different outcomes from that process. There are also situations where someone could have forgiven, but their communities or neighbors or family members have not. And a case in point was in Luwero, where one of the very notorious member of the NRA, the National Resistance Army movement, that is now the UPDF, or the Uganda People's Defense Forces, used to commit a lot of atrocities. And in one village, when he returned, he apologized. He asked for forgiveness, and the village forgave him. But the neighboring village organized and came and speared him at night and killed him. You know, so there are also those kind of situation. So I don't want to preempt what will come in the documentary. Let me screen it, and then we can discuss afterwards. Thank you very much.
You can say that there is physical peace, but mental, how do you survive?
The project has aimed to try to answer our research questions by hearing the voices of ordinary Ugandans. Over the last couple of days, we've done that through focus groups. The focus groups have been quite extraordinary. I have heard some of the most horrible and unimaginable sufferings recounted by the people.
Uganda has been presented internationally as a forgiving country. And a case in point is the amnesty law of 2000, which is an act of political forgiveness, pardon, forgiveness, and discharge from any kinds of liability. But we also know that for a very long time, this country has endured a cycle of revenge, because most of the conflicts that we see in different parts of the country are a result of unaddressed legacies of violence in other parts of the country.
So from 0000, there was no parliament which were really so gathering us together to administer ourselves until 1945. It is when the Legico was opened, where the language, the word can sit together and start debating as a communist state of together. And this was not enough because they were commanded by Europeans. This brought a gap in between. So they were going to know where to interact with the Acholi, or either the Langi, or either the Karamajong, or what. So we grew as if we are trees within the same forest, but it grows within their spheres. So therefore, there wasn't any creation of brotherhoodness amongst ourselves. So what do I mean? What I mean to say, this has brought in tribal conflicts. So the political conflicts emerged from tribal conflicts.
In my village, just a village neighboring mine called Nyambuko, 9 people were slaughtered in one morning. And out of those 9, one was pregnant with twins. and the belly was slit open. This was the intensity of violence. I think it was 27th September 1997. 14 people were murdered in cold blood. 14. 4 of the dead were in one spot. They were sleeping on the same bed. I saw this with my own eyes. The rift in society was continually increasing as people traded accusations on who is responsible and who is not responsible, because nobody came out in a clear-cut fashion to say this is the responsibility.
Saa moja hivyo hapo pale sports hapa alikuwa maembe mmoja kubwa dodo ika hapo. Sasa nikakutana na wadui 6. Na hao walikuwa wanavaa uniform ya jeshi. Sasa wakanisimamisha, we mama simama. Nikasema mimi bado nazungumza hivyo, mmoja akanisamba chini. Sasa huyo kunisamba chini kaanguka. Haya wawili hizi wakaanza kukuja kunikama kunishika, mmoja akanishika mkono hii, mmoja akanishika mkono hii. Alafu tena wawili, mmoja akanishika mguu ya pande na mmoja akanishika. Sasa ule mwenye alinisamba ndiye alianza kunirepu. Huyu alirepu mimi kumaliza, na hawa watano yote tuseme wakanimalizia kwa mwili yangu.
So that odo kunu that test ise bingone tenyone
Nodo wajeto maboy.
Is ado kunu kira emela ko ise bingone
Ati abala je bidai kina consider no.
Ise bingone tenyone.
The soldiers were bargaining that they should leave for him a jaru so that he can come and also kill. So by the time he got out from the grave,
okay, ise bingone.
You also cut him with the hoe.
Ise bingone.
Okay,
Bobe Sebengone. Okay, be Sebengone. At that here, you know, Mamma people are getting one. I just can't tell them what I see. Oh, Bunny, they do. Oh, Bunny, they do. Now, I don't want to do it tapey.
First, when we reached first time, there's not one of us. It's not and I expressed that at my age, it's not like someone. Here I'm seated here, all the blood on me, and no washing the blood stayed on me until after like 3 months.
If you had to kill your dad right now, can you do it? My brother was like, no. Of course, at that time, those people had strong orders. They gave him a panga and cut him in 2 pieces. Afterwards, when now he was dead, they told him to cook that thing. So after, then they told him again to eat.
Ugandans need to forgive one another, each other. I think each one of us has contributed to our sickness, to our suffering. There's no group that will say is innocent when it comes to this matter. So nobody should come and claim the others were the bad people, we are the right people.
Kwenye ngara ketunga, oponi oyangarero ni bunga yole ay kaja kino musalaba. Kwenye mamine idoli jo aray mamjila chene konta kusole intimi nichie.
Baba wende nguruse kosi mungu kolecho chadani kiseshi. Nye nguruse wati dani bade mumbele tiyani kiseshi. Kolecho nechirala mtivu. Tusana tukomye mbele yandigenze ziranda. Obo buso kutakoma. Nokugira wudira kembele yandibade musi. Nosobola tusana musi.
Naye Yesu yalinga ali ku musalaba. Agamu ku maloboozi agasemba omulamu yagamba nti mukama wange basonyiwe kubanga ekibakola mutegeeza nga bwe mugoberezi kusinga ku ddoboozi eryo Yesu Kristo lyagira yafulumya nange mwesirira okusonyiwa.
Ewaffe wano e Buganda singa omuntu akugamba nti nno nsonyiwa tekikkirizibwa kuddamu mirundi iwere esatu nti nsonyiwa, wagambira nti nsonyiwa ekyokumuddamu omugamba nti nkusonyiise.
Okusonyiwa kulina kuleeta eddembe. Bw'osonyiwa munno muba mwegasse. Ate okusonyiwa okwo kuzibu. Era okugenda wagundi okugenda nti ngenda wagundi kumusonyiwa olina kumala kwenyweza.
Reconciliation is not a matter for public declaration that you pass a law and say Uganda is now reconciled, so be it. No. It takes so many things for me to begin healing and for me to begin not necessarily forgetting, but now slowly forgiving the people who caused me suffering.
I think one reason we're not forgiving is people have not come out to say, I'm sorry, I did this. I think one of the reasons is truthfulness.
At least if Koy wants to be forgiven, let him come out from the bush.
I will not forgive Koy unless one of them to come out, apply to me that he may forgive us.
And also the government should forgive us. You know, sometimes the government will not believe that we are abducted, but they may believe that we went there purposely to fight it.
Omugamba munange nsaba kunsonyiwa olw'okuba nakola kino nakino naye ne wabawo ekirala kyombikolwa.
Kwogera kyangu nti nkusonyiye naye nga tubize ekikolwa kikulu nnyo.
Forgiveness is very complicated in its own way, and according to some of the participants that we met, that forgiveness seems to be a very personal initiative.
Kusemea kwanza nilisemea kwa hizo watu mwenye walinifanyia, kwa maana hao mimi bado hujua, wao pia bado kunijua, na Mungu anasema usemee.
I looked at the future of the enemy, and it's back around. So that's why I forgive him. I say now, in the future, if I continue, this man, he will spoil all my family. He will spoil more of my future. It's better I forgive him so that he can also forgive me.
Not only them, but I forgive everyone who has hurted me. Yeah.
When I saw him, I just didn't hold him. I forgave him. I forgave him.
Whereas forgiveness can be a process whereby a victim moves to a survivor, it can be a complicated process because it requires a victim, a perpetrator, and the community at large.
And if there is no total forgiveness, there is still no peace in this region.
Naye ng'eggwanga tukinonyerezaako mu bbanga lye twakamala wano tewannabaawo nkola ku mbeera ng'ekwataganye na ggwanga ddamba enkola ey'okudda wansi okuteesa n'okusonyiwa n'okutabaganya.
Naye nga sirowooza nti waliwo enkola erambikiddwa nga yeesigamiza ku kusonyiwa.
Forgiveness will play an important role in Uganda's quest for justice and reconciliation. But we also must recognize that different communities will forgive under different circumstances. They have different motivation to forgive, and they have different reasons and different expectation from any process that was going to lead to forgiveness.
Okay, so let's now introduce our last speaker in this excellent panel, Miss Angelina Atyam. She's a co-founder and mentor of Concerned Children and Youth Association Uganda. She's a United Nations Peace Prize winner of 1998. Her daughter, Charlotte Avino, was abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army on October 10, 1996, and remained captive for 7 years. Angelina Atyam co-founded the Concerned Parents Association of Uganda and was a key person in the advocacy for the unconditional release of children and youth abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army. So I have the pleasure to introduce Angelina. The floor is yours.
I'm so blessed to be here again, to see the faces of those wonderful people who are with me at Assisi. And from Assisi, the message we got was to continue the struggle. And yesterday on my way from the airport here, a taxi driver asked me, "Where are you from?" And I told him, "I'm from Uganda." What he could remember was only Idi Amin, the dictator who led our country, brutalized the people, and he could only remember the bad side of Uganda. But then I told him, yes, Idi Amin, we have forgiven him. He couldn't understand, how could we forgive Idi Amin? Here in Washington, very far away from the scene, he couldn't understand why forgive Idi Amin. But something wonderful happened in May this year. When I was back from Assisi, we came together with the Catholic Church bishop, the Anglican Church bishop, the Pentecostals, and many, even the Muslims. And we said, let us reconcile the people of Lango sub-region, and that is my tribe. We feel things are not moving properly because we have not forgiven really one another properly. And so we called a convocational prayer. And that prayer brought people from all corners of Uganda to meet one another and ask for forgiveness. And I was so blessed to see and meet the son of Idi Amin. And he got up to apologize on behalf of his father and the whole family. Yes, that was an opportunity to embrace him, to embrace love and real forgiveness. So we started a new thing, a new chapter, the convocational prayers, which is now spreading throughout, but it started from my district. It is also going to other. It has also been in Karamoja, in West Nile, in Alur land. Also, that thing happened. So to go back to my old story, you have already been told that in 1996, I was practicing midwifery in a private clinic. I enjoyed what I was doing. And I enjoyed handling babies when they are still inside there, you know, our relationship with the babies. Enjoying listening to their heartbeat, touching the mothers, and telling them, you know, I've become your family members also. Because the baby inside is my interest, but also the interest of the family. So, yeah. So that interest continued in 1996. When the rebels, we have just watched them march through the jungles, stormed the school and abducted 139 girls from that school and just taken them captive in the jungle. The headmistress of the school was an Italian nun, a very fragile sister. But she had the strength of a lioness. She, with one teacher, followed the rebels and caught up with them in the bush and pleaded with them, please release the children. After some time, they divided the girls into two groups. In one group, they put 30 girls, and these 30 girls were retained, my own daughter inclusive. The other 100, the other bigger group were eventually released to this sister, and they came back. On arriving at school, we parents had gathered together. I saw, big men, doctors, people, men. In Uganda, men don't cry easily. But I saw men sitting on wet ground, crying like babies. And so we had to console one another. How could we console one another? We were all crying. We cried for weeks. And every day we could go to the church. I was so happy yesterday to be in the chapel down here. I had a feeling that I was in that cathedral in Lira where we used to gather every day to pray. And we prayed every day. But deep in our hearts, we were very angry with the rebels. There was unforgiveness in our souls, in our hearts. One day during the fasting prayer, as we groaned to the Lord, somebody got up and said, the Lord's prayers. Forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sinned against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Then there was a conviction that came to me, and I got up and I said, have you heard what the Lord said? If you don't forgive, if we don't forgive, He will also not forgive us. We are asking Him to intervene in the release of our children and eventual restoration of peace in our region. If we don't ourselves forgive, no one will come from any other place to forgive. And I sat down, and everybody walked out one by one. There was no saying of the grace of our Lord, because the Lord's prayers had spoken very clearly. And so we went home without saying the grace. And we were so bitter, and we realized we wasted so much time going to pray there every day, and yet our prayers was not reaching where it should go. We tried advocacy through the government, to the police, the what. We did not see any support coming. But that time, when we came, the next Saturday, we came back together and we continued fasting. But we started by declaring that I think the Lord gave us a message. So we called upon each of us to forgive. Forgive the rebels. And we were not sure will the children come back or no. But forgiveness is unconditional. We wanted that relationship with God, because if you don't forgive, don't come to me to pray. It was like a message for us. Why are you praying if you have not forgiven your enemies? And so we decided to start talking about forgiveness. And then each of us had testimonies. The following Saturday, each of us had testimonies to give. We went to people who grieved us, the people who laughed at us when we lost our children. people who rejoiced and said, well, you lost your children because you took them to that good school. But now we are the same because you have lost your children and we did not take them there. But we decided to go to church people who were our neighbors, not the rebels, and tell them, we have forgiven you. You pained me so much. You did not abduct my child, but what you told me added pain into my spirit. And so they also came out to say, forgive us. I remember a woman from western Uganda was married in northern Uganda. The husband died. She had only one daughter, and that daughter died the week the daughter was abducted, with my own daughter together. And she had somebody who actually taunted her so much. But God also spoke to that other person, and he came in the morning ringing the bell. But she had also planned already to go to the man to ask to be forgiven because he was so bitter with the man. But the man decided to come first without invitation. He had no child taken. But he said he was haunted in the night. He felt he had to come and apologize to this old lady. So when he rang the bell of his bicycle, the old lady rushed out, saw him coming, and just gave him a seat, greeted him, welcomed him. He was very surprised. But eventually he told her the reason why he came. And so she said, forgive me also because I was so angry, so bitter with you. But today I'm declaring that I've forgiven you for hurting me. And so the message we got, we did not want it to die in my district. We started to go out in other districts. So the districts we went to was in Gulu, the district of Joseph Kony, the leader of the LRA. And when we went there, we shared our stories with the parents who were actually affected like us. I remember this old woman, blind. She asked me, Angelina, what are you talking about? I told her, we have come here to share the message of forgiveness so that eventually we can be reconciled and the peace that we are looking for can return to our land. And she told the congregation, I think Angelina is from another planet. She's not from northern Uganda. I've lost a son, and my son was my sight. He was my guide. I can't see. And when the rebels come, he was the one who used to guide me, to hide me, to get water for me, to get food in crisis situations. But they took him. And she opened her dress, and on her chest were scars. On her back were scars. The rebels had chopped her many times. In fact, 7 times on her back. So 7, the number 7, I don't know. It has some relevance in forgiveness and love. I believe that. How can I forgive the LRA? But I told her, I'm coming from another district, but LRA come from this very district, your district. But they also went there and took my daughter. If we don't forgive, the bullets will fly, and the bullets have no eyes. They will shoot anybody they see in sight. And that could be my daughter, that could be your son, that could be any child. So by allowing war to solve these problems, we are signing the death warrant of our own children. We need to forgive. And everybody, no one, a large congregation of about 300 people, No one got up to go out and say, we will not forgive. Because then we ask, are we ready to sacrifice the children to war? Will we want bombs to drop on them and clear them up there? They are being called rebels, terrorists, but they were abducted yesterday, some of them this morning. How could they be terrorists? And so forgiveness started filtering into the communities. We want to thank the Mennonite Central Committees, because one day we went to their office and they asked us, what do you want? What do you want to do? We told them we want to build peace in the communities. And that was a good thing. They said, good. Somebody to come and ask us what we want to do. We want to build peace. And so, together with the religious leaders, some politicians, but traditional leaders were also involved. We continued prayers and fasting, of course, and then going out to forgive. My daughter was taken, and the man who held her as a slave was alive, but it was a man from Gulu. One of the children who returned from captivity narrated the story with whom my daughter was. And so I decided to go out to this mother of this rebel and talk to her. The first time she saw me, she was very restless. And I called her, my sister, you don't need to be restless. You lost a son. He's a commander in the bush, but you are missing him here at home. He should be helping you. He should be supporting you. And the lady did not understand why it should be me who should be coming to her home and ask her and offer forgiveness. But eventually she understood. The day she shared her experience also, when her son joined the rebels, she was so stricken with grief. She never enjoyed life. And so she asked me to forgive her and all her family members, including her son, who was holding my daughter. And I was overjoyed. We embraced, we laughed, and we danced together. Because she had also forgiven me for being very angry with their families in the beginning. I was also set free, and she was also set free. After 7 years and 7 months, my daughter returns, and I just insisted on asking God. The 7th year has passed, and the Bible tells us it is the 7th year is so important. It's the year of freedom. It's the year of restoration. It's the year of peace. Where are our children, Lord? Have you forgotten the 7th year? And that day, I just said these prayers and told God, I know you don't change. I was asking God many questions. Can you imagine Angelina asking the Almighty God many questions? I one time asked him, Jesus, when you went to Mary and Martha, why did you cry? You cried. Yes, because Lazarus was dead. Why did you cry? And you are God. Why do you make the pain of a child so deep in the soul of a parent that makes us very sick? I did not get an answer. Only after 7 years, in the night, did the Lord speak to my daughter who was being held by the rebels And the message was, today is your day. And she groaned and she said, And is a question. Is it true? It is possible. Who are you talking? What are you saying? But then when she woke up, the rebel started beating her. You were talking to somebody in the night. Who were you talking to? She was talking to that soul, that spirit in her. And she was beaten. And before that one, there was a day she was beaten 100 strokes because the mother went to advocate for unconditional release of all the children on the radio. So the rebel leader said, you are the leader of those children who want to escape, so you must be punished. She was punished, 100 strokes, and she was left in the heat of southern Sudan in an open air, hot sand. She laid there unconscious, and people were instructed not to go near her. Don't give her water. If she wants to die, let her die. As she woke up the second day, and still, when she came back, she said, Mother, we have forgiven the rebels. But one time the rebels asked me, Angelina, we could give back your daughter if you stop advocating for their release. But I told them, I cannot. My child is every single child that you are holding captive in the bush. So our slogan is, every child is my child. We formed the Concerned Parents Association after that. And our vision was that land of freedom, the land of joy, the land of love and forgiveness, where people live in peace. And our mission was to get there through advocacy, through lobbying. And one day I told my president, I hate the guns. And he said, you don't understand what you are saying. The gun is also good. But I told him, I hate the guns. I love people to talk. After many years, many of these abducted children have come back home. They needed rehabilitation and eventually be integrated into the communities. But that process is not complete and cannot be complete because the magnitude of the pain and what they witness has been just too big for quick recovery. So we are emphasized to them, unless you forgive, the pain will still be there. But most of the children ask us and say, our education has been interrupted. We want to go back to school. But education right now is very expensive in the north. And these girls still want quality education. So these girls, eventually when they escaped, none of them were released. But out of these 30 girls, 24 escaped. 4 were killed by the rebels. I mean, 1 was killed by the rebels. 4 were killed by the soldiers dropping bombs on the children and calling them rebels. And I'm talking about the 30, that is an example only. But there are still many children unaccounted for. The children, very young, who had to travel through northern Uganda, into southern Sudan, into Congo, into Central African Republic, on foot. How many of us could make the journey on foot? with heavy load on your head, being driven as slaves, minimal to eat, getting pregnant on the way, having to give birth in the absence of a midwife, of a clinic, of a doctor. My daughter, when she gave birth, the rebels, there was one a little bit gentle. It said, let us take her to a health unit in Juba, that is Southern Sudan. But the moment Joseph Kony, the leader, heard she was taken out for treatment, she was brought back very quickly. They had just given her initial treatment, but then she was brought back to the camp. And is the jungle law, no medicine, no what. Yeah. So the pain in the hearts of the children was also very big. But when they came back, I asked the children to forgive us for failing to protect them, and also to forgive the rebels for what they did. And the children told us, we have forgiven the rebels. It is also good you did not accept the offer of the rebels to release your daughter, because they would have taken advantage of it. They would think you need money, you need other material things, but we need peace and to hang together. And the children who came back gave us so much hope. They were so courageous. And so the children bore children in captivity. And the children born in captivity don't know their family relationships with other people. The commanders took the girls. These girls from the boarding schools were given to specific commanders, and they were not transferred. But now also, the child has a right to where do I come from? Who are my parents? Who are my grandparents? Who are on both sides, my mother and my father? But these children have a dilemma, because when they come back, we as parents have decided to encourage one another to accept these children, to accept our own children, plus the children they come back with, and to make it good for them again, because the many years they wasted in the bush, that is a gap already in their lives. We have to bridge that gap through continuous psychosocial support, educational support. If we fail to educate them, it is like we are sitting on a time bomb, because they will think they lost the opportunity because of negligence of adults in Uganda. But since we are now joining hands and building peace together and forgiving, the high percentage that you saw on the screen is actually an indication that we are moving forward towards forgiveness, love, and sustainable peace in northern Uganda. I know we could talk for 10 days here on the topic, but for today, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this touching story, Angelina, and thanks to all the panelists. Due to time constraints, I would like to open the floor now for comments and questions from the audience. So please go ahead. Okay, go ahead. Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Genesis Lazo. He's working. Okay, my name is Genesis Lazo, and I intern for Salam Institute for Peace and Justice. I'm also a student at George Mason University. Your story was really touching. I was the one standing up. I was wondering, we've heard a lot about the victims, but have you encountered any experiences with the perpetrators outside of the experience you talked about with the mom. I know that much of the conversation has to do with the victims, but I think what I didn't hear as much about was the conversation regarding the perpetrators and how they forgive themselves and how they establish themselves again once they're forgiven.
And this question is for Angelina or anyone? Okay, so who would like to answer?
The rebels, we kept calling them on the radio, come home, all of you come home, you are our children. The perpetrators, some of them did return. Many rebel commanders did return to northern Uganda, and they are living in the communities right now because they passed through the Amnesty Act, the amnesty law, and when they came home, there was the traditional way of cleansing. They also went through it, which actually takes two families to be reconciled. When a crime is committed in our communities, the two families come together, the family of the victims and the perpetrators. And they accept, first of all, is to accept, yes, that crime was committed. And the perpetrator himself will say, yes, I did it. And then the two sides will come together. They will hold meetings, and then eventually we call it matter or put. Matter or put. Or put is a tree, a plant, but very bitter in its root. But we symbolize the drinking of the bitter root as washing away the bitterness, washing away the resentment, so that we can walk again together. So both sides of the family bring something to the celebration. The victims, mostly, if they have nothing, no problem, but be there with your family. The perpetrators and his family, they go on the crime. So it is not a one-man's thing, it's a family thing now. So he comes with his parents, and his hands are tied behind him in humility to say, I've failed you, I'm sorry, I did it, I admit, but I need your forgiveness. I need your coexistence in these communities. And so they, together with the family of the offended, they drink that bitter herbs. And then they slaughter a ram. They make a party. They rejoice together. And then they will declare that today, nobody from the home of the victims will go to the home of the offenders to take revenge, because we have forgiven. It's a public forgiveness. And so somebody was making fun of it, justice and peace. They call it the calabash justice. But it is good, the calabash is the container, but at least that was a process to get to our point, and we are very grateful for that.
Okay, very good. So we have...
Thanks a lot,
you would like
Angelina.
to-
I wanted to supplement a bit. What Angelina has actually said is a situation where actual killing has taken place. The perpetrator of the killing is known, and then there is communal ownership of the evil that has taken place, because we believe that we are a community. The perpetrator belongs to a community, so they own up the process. But to also supplement on that, one thing that I want to note is that the situation in northern Uganda was highly complex. And as a result, we had dual identity. We have children who were forcefully taken away from their homes, turned to become perpetrators against their own communities, and are now returning home, either as victims or perpetrators, depending on what angle you look at it. Hopefully, a mother will look at a child as a victim of conflict, but the general community to which this child was forced to perpetrates atrocity will definitely look at the child as a perpetrator. So when you hear us talk about victim, perpetrator, it's a complex situation. In our situation in northern Uganda, it's quite complex. You don't know when to call a child who was returned from the bush as a victim or as a perpetrator. And also, when you look at the LRA war, the clarity between who is a senior commander or someone who went to the bush voluntarily is quite thin. Whereas the greatest majority of the would-be perpetrators were mainly children who were like abducted and later turned out to become fighters in the LRA, and because of that, they rose through the ranks to become commanders. I will cite an example maybe based on my work with the Justice and Reconciliation Project. Like I said, I head the documentation department, which is mainly a research project. In most of our documentation, we always try to give a chance for the formerly abducted persons to give the side of the story, whether from a lens of a perpetrator or of a victim. And then we also have a network of formerly abducted women who call themselves the Women Advocacy Network. And I've seen a couple of times some of these commanders who have like forcefully abducted these ladies, impregnated them, forced them into slavery, and now they have returned home in a more of a disempowered situation. A lot of them turn back to these women to help them in family tracing. So currently we are having situations where former perpetrators, I would call them in quote, are now resorting to these women whom they enslave to help them to get to the identity of their children. Thanks.
Okay. Very good. So we have time, actually, unfortunately, for only one more question because we have another speaker after this panel. But you are welcome to speak with our panelists after the panel. So, Thais, would you like? Mm-hmm.
Yes, I first of all, of course, want to thank the panel, but especially I would like to highlight, I've heard the story many times, but each time that Angelina tells the story and the details, it becomes richer. And I think there are 2 points that I would like to highlight, which I think in this process of love and forgiveness and of Fetzer, I think it's critical. One are these rituals, that like the one that Angelina shared with us, the cleansing rituals, which I think don't come so much in the so-called research, but I think they are critical, and they are part of a lot of the traditions of most cultures, and many times they are brought by women, and I think this should be like more part of the so-called accepted research, outside of what we know, third party and this and that, because we know that big traumas, they have an energetic side that has to be removed, and I think these healing processes are very important. And the second one are the process that you described in detail that I think it's has to do with a lot also this realm also of women, mothers, families that are critical. And this is what, like with time, can heal. Because forgiveness, it seems nice, but in certain situations which are very traumatic, it requires these elements. So thanks again, and I hope that these teasers that you gave to us kind of can also inspire research and the value, the possibility of giving another value to these wisdoms.
So thank you for this comment. I would like now to invite everybody to fill out a survey about the panel and even the panelists, and give us feedback and comments on how to improve, what you liked.